And as you heard, my name is Steve Post. I'm the faculty co-chair of the FACT committee. I want to welcome everybody to our January session, especially our FDP new members or new participants in the FDP. And I'm looking forward to presenting some of the stuff we've been doing over the past couple months in line with the theme here of COVID. And the title we've given to this is a silver lining, insofar as there is one, for the COVID-19 pandemic, maintaining our transformative efforts to improve our institutional research infrastructure. And what we're really trying to accomplish here is to look at what we've been learning about the faculty and research administrator collaborations and interactions in this time on which they've been put under a certain amount of stress, shall we say, due to the pandemic. I'm joined today by the whole FACT team. I'll show you them in a second, and my administrative partner, Suzanne Allstat, and we're both at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. Next slide. So the FACT team is the Faculty Administrator Collaboration Team. We've been meeting together for probably about 4 years now. And our mission really is to take advantage of the unique environment we have at the FDP, that environment being a meeting where both research administrators and faculty come together, together with the funding agencies to talk about the administrative burden associated with federally funded research. And we each, that is the faculty and administrators, have our own separate meetings to go to, but this is one, if not unique circumstance where we have the ability to get together to see what we're doing at different institutions. And that's what we're trying to take advantage of here. Next slide. This is the group that's been meeting of late, monthly. They come from around the country and a whole host of different types of institutions, as you can see. Currently, as I mentioned before, myself together with my administrative partner, Suzanne Allstat, are co-chairs of the committee. You'll be hearing from several of these people as we go through today, presenting on different aspects of our most recent project. Next slide. And I will say, if you are a member of the FACT committee, it might be helpful as we go through to make sure, if you can, to at least show yourself if you can't have a camera so people can see who you are. So this is my last slide for now, and then I'll shut up. I've just given you the introduction, so we've already done that. I'm going to turn it over to Mark Hazelcorn here in a second, our previous faculty co-chair, to talk about our current project. He will turn it back over to Suzanne to talk about some of the analysis we've done. You were all invited to participate in our current project using a thought exchange crowdsource software. And then we're going to turn it over to a panel of different FACT members to talk about different themes we've pulled out of your responses, your thoughts. And we'll go through those: communication, flexibility, and resources. Then we're going to let Eric Tennyson, who is a team member from Thought Exchange, actually take you into Thought Exchange yourself to show you some of the depth of what we were able to collect, but not present today, and set up the foundation for a discussion and what we might be able to do as next steps. So with that, by way of agenda, I'm going to turn it over to Mark to discuss what we did, how we got to where we are, and what our tool that we used. So Mark.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you everyone who's here. We hope you'll all take the opportunity to interact with FACT if it's in your area of interest. So I get the pleasure of introducing the current FACT project, and I'm going to do it in two parts. One as a natural experiment, and the second as a methodology to take advantage of that natural experiment. So everybody imagine there was an organization that for more than 3 decades had been studying and working to improve a very complex system. And that was a system of federal employees and university administrators and university researchers all working to support the national research program. And imagine that a subgroup from that organization, and we can call that organization, let's call it FDP. Imagine that a subgroup came to the executive committee and said, we have a great idea. Let's require that everyone work virtually. Everybody supporting the national research program work virtually. And we can look at and see how what the pros and cons of that are. What did we learn from that experiment? I mean, who'd have thought that the executive committee would say yes? And we'd actually all be in the middle of this experiment right now. Pretty good. So here we are. We are now in the middle of this natural experiment thanks to COVID. And the second question is, the second part of this intro, how do we take advantage of it? How do we discover what we've learned from this natural experiment? And the way we would like to introduce crowdsourcing. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of crowdsourcing. It's a method that is producing far more, as Steve just said, than we can present to you today. Actually, the initial AI in the crowdsourcing system that we used, which is called Thought Exchange, produced, I believe, 12 themes. We cut it down to 8, and we're only presenting 3 today. The impact on communication, the impact on how people engage and access each other, and the impact on resources. And so with that, let's learn about this project and find out what we learned. So I'm going to hand this back to Suzanne, and off we go.
Thanks, Mark. This is Suzanne Allstadt. Nice to see you all here. As Steve said, I'm the administrative co-chair of FACT. If you haven't participated in Thought Exchange, I'm going to kind of hit some high points. We're going to ask Eric to go take a deeper dive into this. As Mark said, we started out with a huge amount of themes, and we really had to narrow it down for this presentation today to show you guys something that you could actually take a bite of without getting completely overwhelmed. So with the way that the Thought Exchange is set up, you start out with a question. And our question was, how has COVID-19 positively or negatively impacted faculty administrator collaboration in support of your research mission? Next slide, please. This is how many people participated in our Thought Exchange. 66. We had 86 thoughts. So after signing into the exchange and reading your introductory questions, you're given a few survey questions and statements. Then you're asked to share thoughts, and then you're asked to rate the thoughts of everyone who's been a part of the exchange. So you can see we had 86 thoughts, and then we had over 1,200 ratings of those thoughts. Next slide, please. The first of our survey questions, we wanted to see where in FDP our respondents sat. We had 72% respondents who were administrators, 25% faculty, and our 3% technical folks that we really appreciate you guys taking part of this as well. Next slide, please. Although this is survey question 2, this is actually a statement, and we asked people if they disagreed or agreed. So this statement is, the administrative burden associated with research awards has increased during COVID-19. 81% of you agreed with this statement, 19% disagreed. So overwhelmingly, people said yes. Of course, the administrative burden has increased. Next slide, please. So then we wanted to dig into the collaboration, which is at the heart and soul of FACT. So our next statement was, effective collaboration between research administrators and faculty has been compromised by the response to COVID-19. I was actually a little bit surprised that 57% agreed with this, and only 43% agreed, but we'll get into more of that later. Next slide, please. All right, and our final survey question statement. There are responses to COVID-19 that impact faculty administrator collaboration, which should remain in place after restrictions have ended. 85% of us said, absolutely, we agree with that. There are things that we've been doing that need to remain in place. Next slide, please. This is one of the options that Thought Exchange allows us. Most of you have probably seen a word cloud before. Some interesting things start popping out here. There are things that you would imagine would automatically be there considering our topic, like remotely, virtual meetings. But you also see things pop up like communication and understanding and the word positive. Next slide, please. We started out by looking at all of the thoughts together before we started stratifying them into different themes in different areas. So these are the top 3 themes that were rated by those 1,200 people who took part in our exchange. I'm not going to read all of these to you. I just want to hit a couple of high points for you. So since COVID forced us to work from home, for many of us, we discovered that a lot of the offices can function 100% remotely, and sponsored programs offices are often seen as one of those groups that can work 100% remotely. So we eliminated travel, the stress, wasted travel, and this has all been pretty positive for a lot of people. The second, our virtual interactions have increased. Obviously, we're in the middle of one of those virtual interactions right now, and administrators have been frequently getting more involved in project meetings and discussions, and that's seen as a positive and something that's helped both investigators and administrators to get proposal submissions out the door. And the third thought, the remote aspect of our work has seemed to open up more communication avenues and opportunities to facilitate the submission of proposals. So obviously, the clearer your communication is between your administrators and your faculty, the more you're collaborating. And it's essential to getting not only submissions out the door, but to administer the awards after they're made. Next slide, please. All right, so here you can see our 3 major themes: communication relationships, flexibility, adaptability, and resources and infrastructure. We will definitely dive into those a lot more. Next slide, please. This is what's called a heat map, and the way that we set this up, we wanted you to be able to see how these 3 themes differed in importance to faculty and administrators. So for faculty, the most important of these 3 themes was communication and relationships. For administrators, it was flexibility, adaptability, and resources and infrastructure. Next slide, please. This is something I'm going to ask Eric to go into a little more live later on, because as a static image, this doesn't really show everything we want you to see. On the left-hand side are our 3 themes. The right-hand side, we broke it down into negative is at the top, positive is at the bottom. And you can start to see how the different themes broke down into positive and negative. So for instance, communication relationships is at the top left. The majority, if you follow that big gray blob, the majority of the thoughts that fell into the theme of communication relationships were positive. There were a tiny little bit of negative ones, as you can see at that very top. For flexibility, adaptability, more negative than positive. And for resources and infrastructure, it's almost overwhelmingly negative, but we did have some positive ones. And we do want to dig into those and give you guys an idea of some of the things we're going to talk about. Next slide, please. I would now like to introduce one of our panel members, Dr. Lori Carter-Edwards. She is going to start us off as we dig into our specific themes. Lori, take it away.
Thanks so much, Suzanne, and welcome everyone. I'm sorry you cannot see my face. This is to ensure a more stable connection. So thank you so much and Happy New Year. I'm at UNC Chapel Hill. The next 3 slides you're going to see are going to show the positive and negative primary themes or concepts that came out from the thought exchange. I'm going to talk about the positive ones here in communication and relationships. And what you'll see here in terms of the 5-star rating, you see the most highest ranking concepts that are themes that were brought up in terms of the positive ones with 15, 11, and 6 respondents accordingly, was more open communication avenues, an opportunity for administrators to get to know the faculty better as a result of more calls via Zoom, and an increased communication between faculty and administration for decision making. In terms of the first one, where there's been this opening up of the communication and avenues to facilitate the submission of proposals, this need for clear communication was raised as essential for the creating opportunities for submission and award administration. Interesting for the administrators in terms of getting to know the faculty, there have been more phone calls via Zoom. There's been more of an opportunity to have an interaction, and not many felt compelled to speak directly on the phone, which fostered more collaboration for actually getting work done. And the final positive impact that was one of the more primary ones in terms of what COVID has done, it's increased this opportunity for decisions to be made and hopefully change systems operations. So everything from whatever there may have been in terms of frustrations or actually the ability to respond more quickly, decisions were being made collaboratively between faculty and administrators. I'm going to now pass it back to Susan to talk about the some of the negative components of the communication and relationships.
Thanks, Lori. So one of the things that we found in our thoughts that were themed into this communication relationships category is that there was an issue of the frequency of the communication and an issue of the quality of the communication. When we get down into the negatives, although this first one says reduced communications leads to more misunderstandings, here we're talking about the quality of the communication that's going on. We, of course, still have tons of people who would much rather meet in the hallway and have a 5-second conversation, get a signature from a faculty member, faculty who would like to go and sit in a sponsored programs office for 5 minutes and get all kinds of situations figured out rather than having 15, 18, 25 emails going back and forth. So this is where those negative issues are coming in. If you can only communicate electronically, you can't see someone's actual body language. And we can get close in this virtual realm here, but you can't physically hand somebody a piece of paper to sign, physically hand them a report, all of these things that a lot of us have gotten used to I've worked in research administration for 20 years. I'm used to seeing somebody in the hallway, passing off a piece of paper. So it's the quality, it's the efficiency. Sometimes it's best to just sit down and have a 5-minute conversation and get everything worked out, again, than have 25 emails back and forth. And as I would imagine all of you have been in situations where you start off with a simple question and you end up hurting a lot of people's feelings because everybody's frustrated and all you want is an answer and nobody's understanding anybody. All righty, we are going to pass this off now to Mark and to Steve, and they are going to talk about issues of flexibility and adaptability. Next slide, please.
Okay. Hi, everybody again. Mark Hasselkorn. If you've been paying close attention, you've noticed, for example, that the negative, that we had plenty of positive and negative thoughts, about equal, but consistently the positive thoughts were rated higher than the negative thoughts. The negative thoughts that that Suzanne just went through, were rated significantly lower than the positive thoughts that Lori went through. The top 3 thoughts that were presented at the beginning were all positive thoughts, all the top 3 rated thoughts. So overall, positive thoughts were rated higher than negative. And on the theme of flexibility, we again see some of those high rated ones. We've seen this one before. Some folks even felt that offices could work 100% remotely, and that was the single highest rated thought in the entire thought exchange. Other examples of positive thoughts here in terms of more work options and more ability to address different types of obstacles, things like that. People could engage when they wanted to. They weren't limited to having to physically go over. So significant positive slant, rather unexpected, to the impact of COVID on your work. However, there were negative, and I'm going to pass it over to Steve to talk about those.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So yeah, so I think one thing that's also pretty interesting about flexibility, this category, relative to communication, is this one was the one that was considered very important by the research administrators, and the impact that COVID or the pandemic has placed upon them. And you heard about the flexibility about worksite options and potential work from home, but I think what was highlighted here was a lot of issues almost related to that. So for example, our own little bubble wasn't the only thing affected by the pandemic. So if you look at one of the big things, you have childcare, preschools, other school. I mean, a bunch of our lives have been disrupted. And one thing that may turn out to be negative with respect to that is how disproportionately that might affect different components of our interaction, particularly either the administrators or the women faculty, for example. I know, or all faculty, I know at our institution, we have already built in an extension for promotion and tenure. Things like that, and whether or not you've adapted to those types of disruptions that really impact how you can move forward in both research and our ability to interact. And I think this was something that came out. The other thing that came out, if you look at the next theme in particular, and to some extent, it relates to the converse of what we saw as positive. There was a lot of flexibility. You know, as Mark described, we have the perfect experiment. Everybody go home and work. Okay, well, now you have the problem of your home life and your work life are mixed. And I know surveys done here prior to the pandemic actually showed a major problem associated with people being able to disconnect from their work as being a reason for disengagement. Well, now we've just broken down those boundaries. We have the ability to connect 24/7, weekends. Have we established boundaries that go along with that type of flexibility, right? The last thing is relates to something that came down a bit from the federal, all right? So a lot of things changed, obviously. But one of the things that changed, there were a lot more different types of opportunities for research, and there were changes in research policies. Every week we got a flyer about now you can do this, or look at this opportunity. And all of those came with different types of measures, different types of requirements. We had to adapt to that. All right, our research admin had to adapt to not just maintaining what's already there, but all of these new policies, all of these new opportunities. And that put a strain in particular, as you'll hear in a second, on resources. Could we adapt to that? Could we be flexible enough to accommodate that? And different institutions were differently affected. And one of the things that I found interesting is when you look at this, some of these things were issues prior to the pandemic, and how were we accommodating these, or were we accommodating these issues adequately before we had this extra stress, right? And have some of these adaptations, these increased flexibilities, what can we learn from that going forward that might make these types of interactions, this type of environment better even without the pandemic? So I think that really relates to the negative aspects about those flexibility and adaptability, is what happens if you can't adapt. So with that, I'm going to pass it on over to David Budil and Lori again to talk about something that sort of fell out very differently from these other themes, and those would be resources and infrastructure related to research. So David, I think you were taking the first stab at it.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Steve. So I'm the faculty representative from Northeastern University, and we took a deep dive into resources and infrastructure, as Steve indicated. And we decided to kind of reverse the order here because, as you saw in Suzanne's presentation, the predominant feeling reaction with regard to resources and infrastructures was actually a negative impact of COVID. And the reverse order kind of makes sense because it corresponds to the time evolution of the impact of COVID on resources. Because as COVID came in, obviously there was many new things to do in order to deal with it, and yet the resources did not increase suddenly at the same time. So the advent of COVID, of course, imposed very strong stresses on resources and the results of that. And then we presume that the situation will pass at some point. And when COVID goes away, we will still be left with the resources that were actually developed to deal with it. And so the positive aspects of positive impacts, they're kind of looking forward to the future and what we can do with the resources that COVID left us. So the comments you see here are not necessarily all the top rated comments as were shown in some of the other categories. But in fact, we got many comments that were really very much the same. And so the ones that are assembled here are really more representative, I think, of the comments, the thoughts that we got. So the resources that were mentioned, the negative impacts really broke down into several categories. First of all, of course, financial resources. Second was human resources. And of course, financial resources were the demands were to basically deal with the impact of COVID, to actually convert universities to online course delivery, to online interaction of faculty and administrators, and deal with hygiene on campus, social distancing, things like that. And there was a domino effect because financial burdens then led to, in many cases, actually staff reductions, which put a limit on human resources. There are further limits, as actually Steve already talked about in the flexibility section, on time, which is itself a resource as well. So people had to deal with all the other impacts at home of schools and daycare duties, and that put a demand and reduced resources as well. And so those are reflected in the thoughts that are shown here. Staffing, budget limitations impacted the availability of people to actually do the work. And of course, faculty had their own additional loads, teaching loads, as teaching went online. And so those all produced a lot of stresses that people felt due to the increased burden of COVID without the resources to deal with it. A final point is that the technology available to deal with, technology resources available to deal with COVID were strained as well, because in fact there's an uneven distribution of internet bandwidth or the computers and so forth that are needed to conduct online interviews and online classes as well. And so there were some reports in the thoughts of that kind of stress on resources as well. But as I mentioned, there are some positive aspects. When COVID leaves, we are left with some technology and some thoughts about how to use it. So I'm going to turn it over now to Lori to talk about some of those aspects that we found.
Thanks so much, David, for that great overview for the negative aspects and also the overview for the resources and infrastructure. With regard to the first one that you see in terms of the positive themes, which was ranked higher than the others, this aligns with the 85% who feel that there's some resources that should remain once restrictions are lifted. And basically working from home, some felt that the offices can function 100% remotely. Now, some of that may not be the case. We've heard from others that my counterpart at UNC, David Paul, has mentioned obviously that there are some of these issues that actually can work remotely, but there are certain things that also need to happen within the office. But what it does in terms of the remote aspects of this is it eliminates the traveling, coping with the stress of traffic, and that basically becoming more efficient has been a positive aspect of the resources and infrastructure. I'm going to jump to the third one and say that the struggles like figuring out new ways to communicate, they may have positive changes like more video calls versus in person. And so these opportunities for identified technologies, whether it's visual idea boards that allow you for brainstorming, using some kind of electronic form for database collection, virtual networking to try to bridge the geographic boundaries and the distance that we would have if we had to meet in person. There's better time management and the opportunity for better training. But we have to figure out new ways to communicate within these infrastructures. And that's what you see rated there at 3.8 with 21 respondents. And then finally, there have been some universities, only a few, who basically have increased staffing to address the COVID emergency. So the positive impact of new hires to help with increased proposals is what some institutions have chosen to do. And so these are some of the positive aspects of resources and infrastructure, which align again with what you see as the initial overarching feedback on keeping some of the infrastructure, being mindful of what David mentioned in terms of the negative aspects as well. I'm going to now pass this on to Eric, who's going to talk more about thought exchange. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Lori. And I'm going to share my screen just really quickly. And it's first and foremost, it's really an honor to be here. I appreciate being included in all of this. And it's been really fantastic to work with this group as we dig into this data. So first things first is we're really going over just the wave tips of this information. I'm not normally the one to pull people back and do high level overviews, but this group was just really giddy with all the information that they had. As you can see, they're still a little giddy. And so they're still deep diving into this. And so what I wanted to show you is a couple of things that they'll utilize as they continue to make sense of all this and in possible future exchanges to really dig further and iterate on this information. So what you're seeing in this little flying spaghetti monster right here is this is the interactions mapped out from the exchange. So this is you and your thoughts and how we all interacted with one another as part of this exchange. And so this information didn't end up just on somebody's desk. It was actually vetted through all of you through this like community sourcing, crowdsourcing platform. So this way we're able to kind of lead you on a road, like we're headed in a single direction, but this leaves space for detours on that path where we can see your idea and your words without your name or anything tied to it, notice and decide. The group can then decide if that's something we need to tackle. If it's a speed bump, we just need to slow down and be really careful as we go over it. Or if it's a left turn we need to make because we're completely off base on what we're thinking. So these are your words in these exchanges, and it's massively valuable. So what I wanted to dig into, just like I said, a little bit further, as part of this, as part of an exchange, what they can do is go in and see how these thoughts ranked as opposed to every single person in the exchange versus just what faculty found important, versus just what the administrators found important. We can really take a deep dive into these. We can also look at, to Suzanne's point, this theme flow. So these are how these negative impacts and all the negative impacts and what categories they flowed from. So if we wanted to dig just into the communications and the negative pieces, we can really just highlight these and start to dig into this report. It's the same as these positive things that we want to continue to do. We have these now at our fingertips. And like I said, these are in your words. It's not our prescriptive verbiage on top of it. Another thing that we can do, which I didn't show this group intentionally, is we can do some cross survey analysis. So we can look at, if you look at actually all of this, the admin team, if we look at, which was the burden and how, whether or not it was effective, we can see that faculty actually agreed with this a little less than admin did, like 66% versus like 84%. And if you look at the effective collaboration, where has it been compromised? It's about 50-50 on the faculty side, and it's dramatically agreed or technically disagreed. It's been compromised. It's been improved and according to the admin team. So I deliberately kept a couple of tools away from them, and we'll continue to dig further into this information as we go from there. And so I'll turn this back over to Steve, I believe.
Okay, thanks, Eric. I can't remember the last time anyone referred to me as giddy, but I appreciate that, and interesting tool you held back on. So I think, next slide, please. Where we've come, and what I hope we've given you a sense of, is what we can do and what opportunities there are for learning here. So I just want to take a moment to try to summarize what we've sort of talked to you about and where it fits in, and hopefully get some discussion about this and where we could go with it. If you remember, for those of you that were at our last session, we started using thought exchange amongst ourselves to explore the concept of trust at an institutional environment, in particular between the collaboration of PIs, faculty, and their research administrators. And one of the major themes that came out of that, if you recall, was communication. Okay, transparency, communication, central. And now, as Mark very nicely described very early on, we've had this natural experiment where the system that we operate in has been stressed. And what did it show us about our weak points and our strong points? And I think it again emerged that communication, interaction is a major component of successful interactions, successful collaborations between researchers and their administrators. So what are we learning from this? What I think we're learning from this are really, what are the elements of the faculty administrator collaboration and how are they important? And taking from our themes and kind of putting them together in terms of, if you were to think of what a successful collaboration is, or what's required for it. I think one of the things that we've highlighted is that what's very important is processes that lead to effective communication and ability to relate to each other. And we saw that in a lot of the themes. A lot of the words that came out talked about email. All right, everyone thought they were sick of email. Now we had Zoom, and all of a sudden a new way to communicate, right? Now we're Zoom fatigued perhaps, but it presented another option, an option that might actually fit in better with a certain types of interactions and allowed for more interaction under a period where the system was being stressed, and those interactions might not have been able to be effective by email. Or for those who remember the telephone, we still have telephone, but there's really no interpersonal interaction there. Flexibility. All right, we got to have the flexibility in how we engage and connect with each other. And I think this is something that we began to see might be missing already, even without the COVID. What are the processes? We talked about, I just mentioned email. Well, we now have another flexibility. What about other types of processes that we interact in? What about the work-life balance, and how important a factor is that really? It looks like it's a much more important factor than we gave it credit for. And that might have really been holding back, and we may gain a whole lot of efficiency by being more flexible to individuals in these types of interactive environments. And lastly, capacity to support and sustain those interactions. And that comes down to the resource and the infrastructure. Can we, and where should we put those resources? Should it be in the technology? Should it be in, we all have, I imagine pretty soon, we've Zoom licensing to be thinking about for the next year. Is this something we want to continue? Is it a efficient means? Is it an option we want even beyond the pandemic, a means of interacting? Are there other means that we haven't even really thought about exploring? I think these are all important components that we're just, and you saw, we have a lot more thoughts to go through in this. And I think that's one of the things FACT wants to do over the next period of time, depending on how many other tools are sitting in there that we don't know about. Continue to look at the data we have and see what it tells us. We have a lot of other themes wrapped up within those themes, or that can be broken down to look at. I think we have seen how this type of a tool, this type of crowdsourcing tool, can be used to gather important information, useful information from large groups such as FDP, that going forward, we may want to use this tool again. I can tell you that getting started with thought exchange is where the effort should really be, because the information you get out of it is directly related to how well you set those questions up, right? So looking forward, we're hoping to be able to use this tool to learn more about our interactions, but we got to make sure we're asking the right questions to elicit the right types of information, and because you see how valuable that information can be. So with that, I think I'm going to open it up. I'm going to let the committee chime in to see if I've left anything out, if there's any more comments they would like to make, and we will take questions either by raising your hand or by leaving comments in the chat room. So committee, any thoughts?
Yeah, well, while we're waiting, I just want to mention, this was really a pilot effort. There's no limit to the number of members of FDP who could have responded. We could have had 800 responses, and we could have had 10,000 ratings, and that wouldn't have taken much more effort to address that, given the tools. It's just we would have had a lot more refined information. So we fully expect to launch a few more thought exchange sessions that are going to help us get insight on our topic of faculty administrator collaboration, and that probably bring in the federal employee role as well. And so look forward to those. And if you'd like to participate in those, we're hoping that'll happen. So be ready.
All right, so again, like I said, I think what we're looking for are suggestions. What can FDP2 as a whole, and FACT in particular, to advance our understanding of how we interact, this component, and take advantage of what we've learned to help reduce our overall administrative burden. Again, if you have such suggestions, please chime in. You can always send them to Suzanne or I, or any one of the FACT team, whose emails you will have in the slides that will be posted after this. So I am not really seeing any comments. Oh, there's a
Oh, we actually just got
Yeah.
one comment. Are there plans to publish the results? And members of the Communications Committee are working on an article for Incura magazine. Yes, in fact, I think everybody on the FACT group has decided that we could retire on just publishing studies post-COVID.
So yeah, that is a great thought. And for those of you who saw, I think it was an earlier session, I think it may have been the faculty session. It sounds like the FDP is beginning to look more aggressively at trying to get, or more openly at having publications. We've had some back and forths in the past with using FDP information, or the FDP data, if you will, to publish on and name in terms of, are they giving us their moniker of approval? But yes, I think that we may be able to learn stuff that's useful. We too have put some papers, a paper, I think every other year or so, Incura asks us for something. And I think having a summary on this in Incura or a similar magazine would be much appreciated. And I would like to see something we can do. Now, I got to remember that this is not an official survey, it is a crowdsourcing. So we got to be a little careful about over-interpreting, but we could move forward on something like that.
So we have a comment and a question. The first comment is that we'd like to see a peer-reviewed piece rather than a magazine article. Yes, we agree.
Yeah.
That wholeheartedly. We've been talking about that for a couple of years. The next question is, I'm interested to know specifically what process improvements have been achieved. What best practices have been discovered for juggling workload, assignments, timelines in a remote environment?
Well, that sounds like fodder for a thought exchange. Actually, I mean, that is a great thing. We have really only touched the surface on that. I mean, identifying that these were issues, that these were this was something that sort of popped up under this stress, that juggling these things is a major problem, maybe a hurdle that was underappreciated. I don't know that we have answers to that. I mean, based on what we have so far, it looks like improved methods or having flexible methods for interacting is one important component of that. Things like Zoom or Teams and the like, that I think would make for a great thought exchange. What are others doing that are to facilitate that work-life balance? Maybe a whole entire thought exchange on that work-life balance would be a useful endeavor.
Let's keep in mind that. Oops, sorry. Let's keep in mind what we have here. We have a group think. This is the FDP group think that we can do, and we can find out what we all are thinking and how we rate all those things that we're thinking. So we haven't yet taken this initial pilot data and looked at it specifically for people mentioning specific improvements that they wanted to point out. So we can do that. And then, as Steve said, we might feel that it merits an additional thought exchange where the prompt question is focused on specific improvements that have been identified, and then we'll get a whole lot of thoughts about that. So this is just, we don't have an answer to that question now, but we now have a mechanism to answer that question. And that's what this is all about.
Okay, we've got a raised hand, and she's had her hand raised for a little while, so I'm going to unmute Stephanie. Let her talk. If I can get the unmute button to work.
Yep.
There you go, Stephanie.
I got it. Hi, everyone. So this is Stephanie Scott. I happen to be the FDP Communications Committee co-chair, because I think someone mentioned that in the chat about connecting with me. So I just want to give a couple of thoughts. I think I raised my hand also before I coherently collected all my thoughts. So hopefully this comes out in some kind of clear, coherent manner. Well, first of all, in terms of thought exchange, I thought this was a great example of how thought exchange, I mean, just this situation and the questions that you asked, how thought exchange is taking, all of these thoughts and creating, qualitative data for us to use. And in thinking about how we can use this information and this data, it also reminded me of the plenary talk that took place, on the first day from Dr. Chris Austin, in terms of how the FDP could potentially evaluate how we were able to streamline processes and collaborate with one another and communicate with one another. That really helped accelerate, getting these COVID-19 projects moving forward like never seen before. And I'm wondering if thought exchange, the information that you've collected so far, maybe future information that you could collect, I'm wondering if this can help us kind of frame a white paper or a publication to demonstrate, how working from home at the end may have helped accelerate these projects and helped, in the positive aspects of this as well as the negative, how it helped accelerate us moving forward and reducing burden. And how does working from home help accelerate science? I think is really where I'm going at, which I know is a really huge, big question, but having things like thought exchange to collect this qualitative data is one way to do it, because I don't really know how you could do it quantitatively, in looking at how we accelerated these COVID-19 projects. Am I making sense? Because like I said, I didn't coherently collect all my thoughts.
Yes, I think you're making good sense. And I think that's kind of what we were thinking and have been discussing. And it's not just, you got to remember that we had both positive and negative. And I see another comment in there. It's not just working at home is good. There were negatives associated with that. And I think that one of the things that we did not get at in this thought exchange, which is an important next step, is when are these options good or when are they advantageous? In terms of research admin, okay, having that flexibility might be a good thing, but having your lab tech at home, just because you can talk to them doesn't make that an effective way to move science forward. They really need to be where the work needs to be done. So I think there's a lot of enrichment of this data that we can do by talking or having additional exchanges that can start to get at these things. We focused on the first step in this pilot, as Mark said. So, but I think you're thinking just like we are. What can we do to try to advance this towards the whens and under what conditions, and can they actually qualitatively lead to best practices? And again, we heard about resources. Not all institutions are going to be equally resourced to use some of the resources. So that might be another thing to consider.
We've got quite a few comments and questions. The next is, have you thought about looking at if policies at different institutions have been changed based on COVID-19 and the outcome of people working remotely? It sounds like everyone is looking at it positively. That is definitely a next area to dive into. I'd like to see more in-depth analysis on items which appear to be oppositional for faculty and administrators, i.e. where the opinion between faculty and administrators differed in positive, negative, or strength of reaction viewpoint. That is a good one.
That is a good one. And you got to remember that we didn't set this up when we presented that heat map. That wasn't really an oppositional map. That was more who had the strongest feelings, not oppositional feelings. So, but that would be something that we could start looking at, for example, in terms of the positives and negative, splitting it up by positive and negative faculty versus administrator. Haven't gotten to that point yet. Hopefully there's a tool for that.
Would FDP members be interested in participating in experiments to compare methods to foster better communication? I would imagine so. Okay. This is kind of a specific one. Is it difficult or impossible to train new graduate students and experimental procedures for wet lab work like biology, chemistry, virtually. I wonder whether the questions about remote work capture this reality. The students are collecting the data for the grant, so that impacts scientific progress directly. Now, Steve, I think you spoke to that a little bit.
All right.
Early.
So yeah, to train, I mean, training, you know, there are a variety of remote or virtual training exercises, particularly in the regards of safety, either biological safety, chemical safety, things like that. Training maybe to do the real experiments, that's a different type of question. I know, I mean, we did not get at that. You know, just anecdotally, I have seen where some of these methods, virtual methods, have been used in high school science classes to set up remote types of learning venues. I don't know. I would think that would be very limited in utility for a federally funded type of a lab, but that's an interesting, yes, I think training is something, and we didn't approach the teaching component. And, you know, if you think about just the didactic lectures versus the interactive lectures that everybody wants to go to. I know, actually, I'm not even going to pretend to be an expert on that, knowing that Mark has used some of these tools very effectively in his educational things. It would be interesting to pool data on how effective some of these things are to reduce, shall we say, our burden in other aspects of our lives and free up time for research.
It would be helpful to know what can be sustained. Some of the acceleration was an extraordinarily effort to address, did not read that right, has been a big effort to address COVID pandemic. For instance, the IBC met 1 to 2 times per week for COVID research, but that is not easily sustainable.
Yeah.
I wonder what if the thought exchange could add to the faculty work survey. You're thinking exactly like we are. There's a couple of comments about flex space. Let me get to, oh, and here's a great example of a wet dense training resource. I'm going to
Jove.
pronounce Jove.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm saving all of this.
Journal of Virtual Experimentation. Yeah, that's it. That'd be interesting to see how much that has gone up over this time.
So there's a great point about converting administrative space to teaching space. We're very short of it at our institution. I think one of my questions I had was the comment about 100% of the sponsored programs offices being able to go remote. At what level in the institution that person was who made that comment? Because if I was a vice chancellor for research or a provost, I would be looking at what administrative offices I could move off my campus so that I could use that space for research or for education.
So Suzanne, there's another comment here that's really good. So we all talk about being fatigued, but it was what, 7 months, 8 months of this when we did our survey. It will be interesting to see what happens and how those responses compare, for example, after we return to, well, whatever we return to normal-ish after the pandemic. I mean, are people still as enthusiastic about some of these alternatives? I think that will be very interesting. We don't have any long-term follow-up on this type of information.
Yeah. So another comment is we need to look at both short-term and long-term effects. Productivity, such as papers published and grants submitted, was very high at my institution in 2020, but the pipeline of data for the next set of papers and grants is much lower. I think that was the experience at our institution too. I would be interested to see how others feel about that. Couldn't be in the lab, so you were writing. Yeah, the delay effects are going to play out for several years. Related to communication, the communication channels for faculty and staff were different in my institution. This led to different information being shared and different priorities communicated. This time period amplified this issue, and this is something we need to address internally. That is an interesting observation. It looks like others had this problem too. Of course, I think that was a problem before for our institution.
Yeah, I think we got better after. I thought we were pretty bad beforehand.
So looking ahead, what mechanism are we going to establish so that all these people with all these great ideas can take part in putting together thought exchange sessions and analyzing thought exchange sessions and, you know, moving forward with all these great ideas using this great tool?
Good idea, Mark. What do you think? I mean, I certainly think that inviting the greater group, larger group of FDP is beneficial compared to smaller groups. But at some point, how do we did this in our last thing. We piloted the questions amongst ourselves to see what kind of information we elicited, and were we striking the right nerve amongst a smaller group. But getting the right question is a very important component of success for these thought exchanges, and getting people involved in that is an interesting question and problem.
So here's another
Well,
comment.
let's not, yeah, go ahead.
Comparisons of pre-COVID-19 and current workloads for teaching, not course credits, but actual time required, proposal submission, funding received, papers submitted and published, graduate students graduating and starting programs, etc. All workflows have been impacted, but cumulatively, has the workflow been accelerated or decelerated? And what's the difference between the perception of that, of the deceleration or acceleration, and what's actually happening? Good points. From an ERA perspective, it became critical to ensure that all research admin systems were running optimally, including business intelligence and decision support tools. We noticed an increase of usage of our central research admin tools by both faculty and administrators. This required increased coordination with our IT colleagues. And if you want to talk about fun, we did a rollout of an upgrade to our grant submission system in October. It was not very fun.
So one thing we can do is a live thought exchange session. We could all be doing a thought exchange session right now on any one of these topics. So one way to move forward would to use thought exchange during a large panel meeting to actually run these ideas and see what we come up with. We can analyze it on the fly. Eric will help us, and that's pretty exciting to do.
Yeah. It's a great idea.
Because in a way, this chat is a primitive thought exchange. Everybody is throwing their ideas out, so we could actually do one. So maybe that's the next step.
I think the next one should be aimed at sharing best practices or suggesting best practices, looking forward a little bit more.
So is this something we would want to wait until our next FDP meeting to do, or would we want to do this in the meantime? This is something we could do. We need to bring that to the executive committee to get an answer.
Well, I would.
It's easy. Yeah, go ahead. It's easier to do when we're all here. So FDP is a logical time to do it. Let's all stay for another hour and do one right now. No, I'm just joking.
Yeah, we could. I would suggest particularly. We greatly expanded what we were able to do with Thought Exchange this time from last time. It might be something we give a couple go rounds on ourselves before, but I would think the most useful, and I agree with Mark, would be to do with the FDP. Be it before, because there's no reason it couldn't be done, pseudo live, open it up, let people participate, and do the feedback live, or at the next FDP meeting, which will probably be upon us pretty soon.
So another comment we had, could the tool be used to look at different perspectives, generate ideas across faculty, administrators, agencies, across specific areas of admin burden, which could possibly result in ideas to pursue I'm getting tired, everyone. To pursue for other work groups of FDP? Absolutely. That's something that this fact is cross-cutting, so we want to help all the other work groups any way we can.
And I think those types of thoughts, I think people are beginning to pick up on how rich a resource these types of thought exchange exercises can generate. We haven't generated that yet, but certainly a lot of these things, and I like the ideas coming across here. And as I recall, we will be sent the chat list after this so we can see that. There's a lot of really good ideas coming across here for topics in individual thought exchange exercises.
So how about this? How about we run a thought exchange on the selected issue between now and the next FDP, and then based on what we learn, we do a second one to expand on what we've learned live at that session. So instead of presenting the results as we did here, we figure out what additional questions were raised, and we address them live with the group that comes to the session. And hopefully everybody who participated will come to the session and want to take part in that extended group think.
That's a great idea. That does, Mark, and it makes really good sense. The other issue we were a little bit gun shy on with running it live was, even amongst ourselves, testing it live through some participants into computer disarray, or Zoom disarray. I think we're probably getting more familiar with that now, so that becomes less of an issue as we move forward. The technical challenges of using Zoom and other resources at the same time. Okay, Suzanne, is there any, including the federal agencies in the thought exchange session, if we were to do a targeted session on specific components of burden as they relate to either institutional or agency policies, would be a great way to try to include them. I don't know what their, we can include them or invite them to participate. I don't know what their ability is to offer opinions like that as a group. Certainly, I think the ones that participate in FDP could.
And it looks to, in the chat box, Alice wanted to echo the concerns about grad students learning lab skills. I would suggest that for the faculty committee or a subcommittee of that committee, that you guys need to tackle that in the thought exchange. There's all kinds of concern that's showing up in the chat, and I know it's widespread in all of our institutions.
Right, so I think that is a very important issue going forward, is, if with not actually being able, we haven't really addressed that type of component, the training issues, the actual work, getting the work done, getting the research done. We focused more on the interactions that we have, the collaborations that we have with our research administrators, but certainly something like that could be done either as a component of faculty subcommittees, or in a thought exchange just committed to itself.
And it would be interesting to assess what I assume is a wide variety of university approaches to sustaining their research efforts. I think some solutions to graduate student wet lab training would emerge in that investigation. That's a really good point, David.
Yeah. I think a lot of institutions were probably relying on staggered approaches, minimal allowed entry, and a lot of hoping, wishing, whatever, for the vaccinations to get out. But again, I think that's an important question because, you know, this is one form of a stress. There are other, I mean, anything we do to make it or learn from the stress will only make it simpler in our daily routine, even without a time of emergency. So these efforts, I think, are important, not just now, but for increasing efficiency, reducing burden all the time. Okay. Where are we at? We've still got a little bit of time, but it looks like we're slowing down in the chat. Does the committee have any other comments based on what we've been talking about in the chat and or about moving forward?
I think we've gotten some very nice ideas for what the next thought exchange session should look like, and we'll have to
For the next 5, yeah. Thought exchange sessions, yeah. There's a lot of opportunities here, I think, which is very helpful for us. Thank you all. Anybody else? Lori, not to put you on the spot, but you're very quiet.
I'm just typing in the chat. I think this was fantastic. This was really rich. Yeah. Thank you everyone for your comments. I think that what we've mentioned and what Mark mentioned in terms of moving forward, and Steve and Suzanne and others, we will seriously take what everyone has said and try to come up with a set of plans for moving forward. What's nice is that all of us get a chance to see what crowdsourcing can do in this space. We know that it couldn't answer everybody's questions, and we know that this was just a start and indeed a pilot. The advantage of this way of accessing information is that we can quickly get it back to you, which is right. in a situation like a pandemic where we're needing to respond very quickly. This mechanism may be a great tool in the future as we try to give you feedback and for us to use feedback moving forward. So that's all I want to say is just thank that.
Great, thank you, Lori. Anybody else? Any last comments from our other participants? Because if not, I'm just going to again say thank you to everyone. This has been very productive. It's been very illuminating for many ways of moving forward. If you do think of anything else, please send them along to Suzanne or myself. If you want more information about FACT, there is a very long website to look at, but if you go to the FDP website, you'll find us under the faculty committee. And with that, thank you all.